This is History Myths and Myth-Conceptions. And today's myth is: the Roman Empire was an absolute monarchy. The Roman Empire wasn't an absolute monarchy. Technically, it wasn't a monarchy at all. Actually, it wasn't really an empire in the first place. But this is a separate subject for discussion. People often project ideas from later historical periods into the past, as well as cliches from movies about gladiators chopping each other's heads off. For example, they imagine 18th and 19th century monarchies and just mechanically transpose this concept. A 19th century monarch is usually a hereditary monarch and has a clearly fixed order of succession to the throne. To a certain extent, he is a sacrosanct figure, until Napoleon comes along and kicks him off the throne and then installs some innkeeper's son in his place. Some of these monarchs were absolute monarchs, which theoretically means unlimited unchecked power. Emphasis on theoretically, because there is no such thing as absolute power. It's just a convenient term. The power of any, even the most absolute monarch, is always limited in one way or another, for example by the presence of an heir, and the very real threat of regicide. How did a person become a princeps, emperor, in ancient Rome? In the Roman Empire, a monarch was officially approved and confirmed by the Senate. And in some cases, apparently, it wasn't just approving him, but actually choosing him. Naturally, the power of the Senate in different periods of Roman history could vary, and obviously there is a huge number of misconceptions about this institution as well. And these misconceptions go hand in hand with a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of power. Many emperors openly had a feud with the Senate, but if we are talking about Rome of the classical period, at least for a few of them, it ended in death, because it is essentially a conflict with the hereditary aristocracy that owns the country. The Senate, by the way, could depose an emperor and did so more than once. For example, it deposed Nero and Vitellius. Labeling the Roman Empire as an elective monarchy is not a very popular thing, but it gives a much clearer picture of the system that was in place. Of course, the unofficial process of selecting a new princeps could be very different from the guy just walked into the Senate and we approved him. But nobody speaks out loud about things like that, about the real mechanics. Just like in our time, it is quite a rare thing to hear a public explanation of, say, the entire process of nominating presidential candidates from political parties. Much of the process is behind-the-scenes talk and informal relationships between decision makers. They usually put the public in front of a fact. And yeah, political analysts and journalists can sometimes share opinions and insider information of debatable credibility. Obviously, the situation in Rome was quite similar, except we don't really have many political analysts from the period. Likewise, people do not quite correctly understand all these stories about dynasties of julio-claudians or Flavians and start imagining the 19th century with the idea that if a person belongs to a certain family, it legitimizes your bid for power for some sacred reasons. In fact, there was no dynasty of julio-claudians, I mean in the modern sense. There was a conglomerate of clans connected by familial ties, the top tier of aristocracy. These clans had a huge influence on the political life of the country. But this is not a situation where we have, for example, a Bourbon dynasty, where you are supposed to transfer power to the closest male relative. The situation can be compared, for example, to the Bush dynasty in the United States. Yes, I know it is not the best analogy, but it explains ancient Rome much better than these false comparisons with the Bourbons, Valois, etc. Officially, there is no Bush dynasty, and belonging to this family does not entitle you to hold the highest government positions. But it hasn't prevented two members of the family from becoming presidents and trying to nominate at least one more as a candidate. And President Obama is related to 6 other presidents of the United States. Does that automatically entitle him to become a president himself? No. Would he have been nominated if he never had these family ties? Well, he probably would not have been able even to start his political career. So basically, we find ourselves in the middle of the discussion about political elites, political clans, and de facto hereditary aristocracy. But if we start calling it a monarchy, well, we will have to label the majority of the countries of the world as monarchies. Some of them will even be absolute monarchies. The Roman emperors tried to create some semblance of a system of transfer of power, and, on paper, it looks like a transfer of power from father to son, which is basically a hereditary monarchy, regardless of how you call the highest office or how you choose to call the whole system officially. The problem here is that it wasn't exactly that. Romans just embedded into the system the legal practice of adoption, which traditionally was very popular and sometimes tended to devolve into a pure farce. The pinnacle of this adoption system was probably Publius Claudius Pulcher, back in the 1st century BC. He desperately needed to stop being a member of a patrician family for the sake of his political career. So he arranged his own adoption into a plebeian branch of the family. And the new adopted father was younger than him. So yeah, formally, the princeps tried to transfer power to his son, but in reality, the heir was his son only on paper. The transfer of imperial power to a biological son was incredibly rare. In the classical period, it actually happened only with Vespasian, Marcus Aurelius, and Septimius Severus. This fact itself raises some questions. Historians quite often emphasize how the Antonine dynasty transferred power by adoption and what a wonderful system it was, until Marcus Aurelius decided to deviate from it. But this was not some feature of the Antonine dynasty, these 5 good emperors. It was a common practice. It may also be noted that Marcus Aurelius married his cousin, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, who formally, after adoption of Marcus, became his sister. To eliminate this legal mix-up, Antoninus Pius officially removed her from his family, after which she ceased to be considered his daughter from a legal perspective. Only then Marcus Aurelius was able to marry Faustina without violating the law. By the way, at a certain point, this adoption scheme also began to work in reverse, because Septimius Severus adopted himself, so to speak, into the family of Pertinax, and his son into the Antonine family. All the Antonine emperors and Pertinax were dead, but that didn't stop him. Later, his quote-unquote grandson, Elagabalus, was forced to adopt his own cousin, even though Elagabalus was 16 and Severus Alexander was 12. Basically, we're talking about an interesting legal practice which people abused any way they could. This is where it seems appropriate to talk a little bit about how Rome evolved into this quote-unquote monarchy. Generally, historians like to distinguish 3 stages or 3 main paradigms of the political structure in the history of Rome: the Roman Kingdom, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. This is a convenient simplification, but it is, well, a simplification. In reality, there were much more iterations of the system, and some of the adjustments could change the picture very significantly. Also, once again, the system of the Principate, created by Augustus, did not abolish the Roman Republic. Officially, Augustus was saving the Republic, not creating some grandiose kingdom with bells and whistles. This is how the word empire is usually used these days. But yes, it was quite obvious to everyone in their right mind that the system is changing, and Roman historians were quite aware that, in time, the principes mutated into monarchs. They were also aware that in any given historical period, Rome had a hybrid system of the government. Even in the so-called Republican period. For example, Polybius and Cicero wrote about exactly that. In a similar way, there was a transition from monarchy to republic in Rome's distant past. And that, likewise, was a very real change of the system. But this transition is also packed with a number of important nuances. The first of which is obviously the lack of primary sources. We learn about the Roman kingdom from authors who lived many centuries later, mostly from Titus Livy. All the stories are wrapped in several layers of legends, and no one takes this information at face value. I have to remind you that the first king of Rome was suckled by a she-wolf, ascended to heaven, and became a god. And the second king was in a relationship with a nymph and visited her regularly in a nearby forest. This wonderful ancient monarchy of Rome was elective, and they also periodically elected non-Romans to office, which includes Numa. No one knows how many kings there were in Rome because, again, we are dealing with legendary and even mythological material. At some point, officially after the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud, there was a transition to a new system of government, which is commonly called republic. But here's another interesting nuance. The Roman res publica is not the same as the modern republic. Moreover, the term res publica, public affair or common cause, was used, if you trust historians like Sallust, in the times of kings as well. But the elected head of state was called rex, a term which in time Romans began to hate absolutely. It never occurred to any emperor, princeps, to call himself rex. Kings were replaced by consuls who were also elected, but just for a limited period of time, and there were two simultaneously, but I digress. When Augustus became a princeps, the first citizen of Rome, well, this princeps word, by the way, wasn't really a neologism or something. The senior senator was called princeps senatus, so it was an upgrade of traditional terminology. And Romans tried to stick to traditional terminology when possible. But the content of this terminology could change, and quite radically. Which means that indeed there is a lot of sense in interpreting the system depending on its essence, and not on how it is called officially. The question is, how far we are willing to go in such interpretations. In the case of the ancient world, people take any liberties imaginable and even invent countries that never existed. For example, the Byzantine Empire. But in modern history, they frequently try to avoid that. North Korea is a de facto monarchy, where supreme power is hereditary. But no one calls it a monarchy, especially since it is officially a democratic people's republic. There is no office of a monarch there at all. Calling it a monarchy is simply inaccurate. Or is it? Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan are de facto monarchies, but on paper it is a completely different system. Or, for example, the United Kingdom is sometimes called a constitutional monarchy, but there is no constitution there. Estonia is, on paper, a democratic parliamentary republic, where the parliament approves the head of state, the prime minister. In 2021, the parliament approved the daughter of the former prime minister as a new prime minister. The prime minister is nominated by the ceremonial president, who is also chosen by the parliament. There are no direct elections in the country. So maybe, just maybe, if a candidate for the highest state position in the Roman Republic was approved by the Senate, then we're dealing with a parliamentary republic, right? We do not call Estonia an elective monarchy. So how can we call the Roman Republic a monarchy, or even an absolute monarchy, if there was no king in Rome and officially it was mostly, well, a republic?